All right, hello everybody, this is Antonio Wolf. We're continuing the introduction to the Encyclopedia Logic, beginning with section 24 this time, the objectivity of thought. Up to now, if I recall correctly, it's been about 2 weeks almost since we last continued this. But up to now, there's been some discussions ongoing about the objectivity of thought in general and ways in which people do not have objective thoughts and ways in which they mistake what that objectivity is. So, section 24. With these explanations and qualifications, thoughts may be termed objective thoughts, among which are also to be included the forms which are more especially discussed in the common logic, where they are usually treated as forms of conscious thought only. Logic therefore coincides with metaphysics, the science of things set and held in thoughts, thoughts accredited, able to express the essential reality of things. Let me finish this next paragraph and see if that elucidates what I might be thinking about the first one. An exposition of the relation in which such forms as notion, judgment, and syllogism stand to others, such as causality, is a matter of this for the science itself. But this much is evident beforehand. If thought tries to form a notion, that is, a concept of things, this concept, as well as its approximate phases, the judgment and syllogism, cannot be composed of articles and relations which are alien and irrelevant to the things. Reflection, it was said above, conducts to the universal of things, which universal is itself one of the constituent factors of a concept. To say that reason or understanding is in the world is equivalent in its import to the phrase objective thought. The latter phrase, however, has the inconvenience that thought is usually confined to express what belongs to the mind or consciousness only, while objective is a term applied, at least primarily, only to the non-mental. Pretty clear. Let me just reread this real quick from the top. So objective thoughts include the forms which are more especially discussed in the common logic, where they are usually treated as forms of conscious thought only. Oh, okay. So with that, he's talking about
judgment, syllogism.
Yes, it's particularly those things of formal logic. Whereas, when he says objective thought, it does include those, but it also includes a far broader range of specific thoughts themselves, not only the forms of thought in which, our consciousness deals with as forms.
Judgment and syllogism aren't even strictly mental. Judgment and syllogisms are ontological processes. Like a plant seed opening with the judgment.
Yeah, and that's why then he says, logic therefore coincides with metaphysics, because it's not just about the forms of my thinking, it's about things themselves. It's not merely even about forms, it's both content and form. Thoughts accredited, able to express the essential reality of things. I do have an essay on Epoche about this. This does seem weird on the face of it, but then just a little bit of thought about it will reveal that no, this is perfectly in line with how we think already. When we have knowledge of a thing, what we have knowledge of is something that is beyond the expression and reception possible in mere senses, eyes, sight, touch, taste, all these other things. All those things are not really what we are referring to ultimately when we talk about the true knowledge of anything. The true knowledge of anything involves factors which only a mind can perceive the unity of, and that unity is there. It's not just our projection. So an example would be, typical thing, the life cycle of a tree or a fruit or whatever, what these things really are is an entire species cycle in existence. Whereas what the eyes and hand and all these other things perceive is only parts of that, but they can't touch the moving thing in its movement. They can't touch the moving thing as a whole thing that it really is. We can only go moment by moment. And if we were stuck only with those immediate perceptions, we would never see a thing for what it really is. We would be stuck forever in appearances. Where it's only a change of one thing to another, and even if a cycle, was actually happening, we would be unable to perceive it because it takes a mind to grasp something that is beyond the material, because the cycle itself is not material as such. And then the other stuff about reason in the world. He says, to say reason or understanding is in the world is equivalent to in its import to the phrase objective thought. So saying similar things, or rather talking about the same content, but a different form of expression. One which, unfortunately, in objective thought has connotations overwhelmingly with merely subjective concerns. But that is not what Hegel is going to reduce that to. 24n. 1. To speak of thought or objective thought as the heart and soul of the world may seem to be ascribing consciousness to the things of nature. We feel a certain repugnance against making thought the inward function of things, especially as we speak of thought as marking the divergence of man from nature. It would be necessary, therefore, if we use the term thought at all, to speak of nature as the system of unconscious thought, or to use Schelling's expressions, a petrified intelligence. And in order to prevent misconception, thought form or thought type should be substituted for the ambiguous term thought. I assume that's just like to get rid of the subjective or the actively subjective connotations this tends to have in our everyday use of this language. When we think about thought, we really think about the activity of thought. And when we think about the activity of thought, we always have in mind a thinker of that thought. And obviously, insofar as thought is the essence of anything, even things that clearly are not living or unconscious in the full proper sense, we can't ascribe to them a sort of panpsychism where we're going to think of them as thinking in our sense of thinking in actively subjective terms. These things are thoughts, but they are themselves not thinking. And I think that's why he wants to consider saying these, calling them thought forms or thought types, rather than just merely thought. Which is, again, as I noted, important. Hegel's not a panpsychist. Do not mistake it. Panpsychism has become somewhat in vogue in the last maybe 15 years or so. And it's mainly because people are kind of getting burnt out on the stupidity of materialism and naturalism, which veers towards materialism. And they think if we just say everything, has some kind of consciousness, and particularly they're appealing to consciousness, not thinking, that, this gets rid of the problem, the hard problem of consciousness. But by doing so, you're positing things that are just not able to distinguish between our consciousness and the consciousness of those things, and why it wouldn't make any sense for those things to be conscious in the first place, because it doesn't. It has a whole set of problems. It flattens the ontology of things too much. And as much as people think the flat ontology is a virtue nowadays, no, it is not. From what has been said, the principles of logic are to be sought in a system of thought types or fundamental categories, in which the opposition between subjective and objective in its usual sense vanishes. The signification thus attached to thought and its characteristic form may be illustrated by the ancient saying that nous, that is, what is nous? It's not mind. It's concept, right? Or intellect, intelligence.
Yeah, I usually just think like logos or panlogism for something like that. We don't really have a good word for this kind of logical materiality or something like that.
Yeah. So anyways, the signification thus attached to thought in its characteristic forms may be illustrated by the ancient saying that nous governs the world, or by our own phrase that reason is in the world, which means that reason is the soul of the world it inhabits, its immanent principle, its most proper and inward nature, its universal. Another illustration is offered by the circumstance that in speaking of some definite animal we say it is an animal. Now the animal, qua animal, cannot be shown. Nothing can be pointed out excepting some special animal. Animal, qua animal, does not exist. It is merely the universal nature of the individual animals, while each existing animal is a more concretely defined and particularized thing. But to be an animal, the law of kind, which is the universal in this case, is the property of the particular animal, and constitutes its definite essence. Take away from the dog its animality, and it becomes impossible to say what it is. All things have a permanent inward nature, as well as an outward existence. They live and die, arise and pass away, but their essential and universal part is the kind, and this means much more than something common to them all. So there you go. Hegel's not a realist about abstract things. This is a weird position, analytic philosophy particularly, like, oh, I'm a realist about abstraction, like, particularly with mathematical Platonism, which is stupid.
Well, they think universals are singulars somewhere, and that's their abstract object. It's completely foolish. I wanted to elaborate a little on, but their essential and universal part is the kind, and this means much more than something common to them all. Something common to them would suggest that it is a predicate they have that could be detached or reattached or something like that. Like each person has an earlobe or something like that. But the essential and the universal is not just something that can be attached. It's what makes them what they are. So you can't take my humanity. That makes me what I am because I am a human. That can't be taken away. It's not like an earlobe. Someone could not have an earlobe, but that would not make them not a human. So it's not just what's in common.
Yeah. Like something merely in common is, just kind of like a mere class. But the universals for Hegel are generative. Someone asked, does that go for gender as well? Answer their own question. Obviously, yes. Yes. And as a matter of fact, pay attention to the word gender. It has to do with generation. To engender. Which is interesting. So a gender, just by the word itself, just going by the structure of its etymology, originally has something to do with some kind of determining essence, which is appearing as specific things physically as well as socially. And that's why gender is important. And that's why people think gender is important, even though they're not even aware of it these days anymore, because a lot of people believe it's important. At the same time, they think it's a complete fiction, socially made up. And if that was the case, one has to wonder why people would think it's important at all. But I don't want to get into a discussion of that, just highlighting something. Continuing. If thought is the constitutive substance of external things, it is also the universal substance of what is spiritual. In all human perception, thought is present. So too, thought is the universal in all the acts of conception and recollection. In short, in every mental activity, in willing, wishing, and the like. All these faculties are only further specializations of thought. When it is presented in this light, thought has a different part to play from what it has if we speak of a faculty of thought, one among a crowd of other faculties, such as perception, conception, and will, with which it stands on the same level. When it is seen to be the true universal of all that nature and mind contain, it extends its scope far beyond all these and becomes the basis of everything. From this view of thought, in its objective meaning as nous, we may next pass to consider the subjective sense of the term. We say first, man is a being that thinks, but we also say at the same time, man is a being that perceives and wills. Man is a thinker and is universal, but he is a thinker only because he feels his own universality. The animal too is by implication universal, but the universal is not consciously felt by it to be universal. It feels only the individual. The animal sees a singular object, for instance, its food or a man. For the animal, all this never goes beyond an individual thing. Similarly, sensation has to do with nothing but singulars, such as this pain or this sweet taste. Nature does not bring its nous into consciousness. It is man who first makes himself double so as to be a universal for a universal. This first happens when man knows that he is I. By the term I mean myself, a single and altogether determined person. And yet I really utter nothing peculiar to myself, for everyone else is an I or ego, and when I call myself I, though I indubitably mean the single person, myself, I express a thorough universal. I, therefore, is mere being for self, in which everything peculiar or marked is renounced and buried out of sight. It is, as it were, the ultimate and unanalyzable point of consciousness. We may say I and thought are the same, or more definitely, I is thought as a thinker. What I have in my consciousness is for me. I is the vacuum or receptacle for anything and everything, for which everything is and which stores up everything in itself. Every man is a whole world of conceptions that lie buried in the night of the ego. It follows that the ego is the universal in which we leave aside all that is particular, and in which at the same time all the particulars have a latent existence. In other words, it is not a mere universality and nothing more, but the universality which includes in it everything. Commonly we use the word I without attaching much importance to it, nor is it an object of study except for philosophical analysis. In the ego, we have thought before us in its utter purity. While the brute cannot say I, man can, because it is his nature to think. Now in the ego, there are a variety of contents, derived both from within and from without, and according to the nature of these contents, our state may be described as perception, or conception, or reminiscence. But in all of them the I is found, or in them all thought is present. Man, therefore, is always thinking, even in his perceptions. If he observes anything, he always observes it as a universal, fixes on a single point which he places in relief, thus withdrawing his attention from other points, and takes it as abstract and universal, even if the universality be only in form.
So if nous is thought as absolutely universal, then I believe what he's saying here is that the I is a singularization of the absolute universal. And hence we are thinkers of that.
Yeah, definitely. Just going to go over a few things again. It says, thought is the constitutive substance of external things, universal substance of what is spiritual. this is mainly because, well, thought is unity. Insofar as anything is unified, if it's unified materially, or if it's unified immaterially, unity is unity. In all human perception, thought is present. So too, thought is a universal in all the acts of conception and recollection, in every mental activity, in willing, wishing, the like. Even in perception, there is a unity, not only of the perception, but is a unity of the perception, which I always recognize as my perception. All these faculties are only further specializations of thought. For Hegel, is being a thinker the essence of man? You could say that. When it is presented in this light, thought is a different part of play from what it has as if we speak of a faculty of thought, one among a crowd of other faculties such as perception, conception, and will, with which it stands on the same level. When it is seen to be the true universal of all that nature and mind contain, it extends its scope far beyond all these and becomes the basis of everything. From this view of thought and its subjective meaning as nous, we may next pass to consider the subjective sense of the term. So this is important, he says, when presented in this light, thought has a different part to play from what it has if we speak of a faculty of thought, one among a crowd of other faculties, such as perception, conception, and will, which it stands to on the same level. Thought does not stand on the same level as the other faculties. Thought is the ground of every other faculty, and then is reflexive upon itself, which is why then he goes upon the discussion of the I, because the I is the thought, which is thought's own self-thinking. Is recognizing the I as universal the epitome of self-consciousness? No, it's not the epitome, though it's the beginning. Because the I is not an empirical object. That's why he goes ahead and says, that I say I and I intend to refer only to my own singularity, but what I actually say is a universal, and what I behold in the I is a universal. It is the concrete universal of the self-thinking being, which thinks its own thoughts as self-thinking. So we say first, man is a being that thinks, but we also say at the same time, man is a being that perceives and wills. Man is a thinker and is universal, but he's a thinker only because he feels his own universality. The animal too is by implication universal, but the universal is not consciously felt by it to be universal. It feels only the individual. And I'm not quite sure what he's talking about with the feeling here. The only thing that comes to mind is that we have feelings towards universals, whereas animals just cannot. Like, we love and we hate ideals. We have ideals. We love and or hate. God, fate, causality, luck, fortune, freedom. All these things. These things aren't individual things in the world. They're universals, and nonetheless, we feel extremely strongly regarding these things. People are willing to kill and die for these things. Animals do not. Animals may like you, but they don't have any cognition of like, oh, I like the abstraction of subjectivity, or the abstraction of love, or whatever.
That would make sense. We can have a feeling for universals, like patriotism, the feeling of patriotism. That's something that you can only understand because of something like the state or country or something like that, but you actually feel it.
Yeah, and I think I think it's a good phrasing. We don't just feel for it, we also feel it. Like, it is itself a way of feeling, just as it is a way of thinking. And then the thing on the eye I thought was pretty clear. So, continuing. In the case of our ordinary conceptions, two things may happen. Either the contents are molded by thought, but not the form, or the form belongs to thought and not the contents. In using such terms, for instance, as anger, rose, hope, I am speaking of things which I have learnt in the way of sensation, but I express these contents in a universal mode, that is, in the form of a thought. I have left out much that is particular and given the contents in their generality. But still the contents remain sense-derived. On the other hand, when I represent God, the content is undeniably a product of pure thought, but the form still retains the sensuous limitations which it has as I find it immediately present in myself. In these generalized images, the content is not merely and simply sensible, as it is in a visual inspection, but either the content is sensuous and the form appertains to thought, or vice versa. In the first case, the material is given to us, and our thought supplies the form. In the second case, the content, which has its source in thought, is by means of the form turned into something given, which accordingly reaches the mind from without. So either the contents are molded by thought, but not the form, or the form belongs to thought and not the contents. So, in using such terms, for instance, as anger, alright, had a bit of a technical difficulty right there, but we should be fine. I should be able to put the video together after finishing. Anyways, where were we? Forms and contents, let's see, either the contents are molded by thought, but not the form, or the form belongs to thought and not the contents. Using such terms, for instance, as anger, rose, hope, I'm speaking of things which I have learned in the way of sensation, but I express these contents in universal mode, that is, in the form of thought. So, and if I take individuals and I try to express them, they take on the form of thought, but then we say that form does not actually belong to the things themselves. It's projected onto them by us. Well, I mean, that's weird. Either the contents are molded by thought, but not the form, or the form belongs to thought and not the contents. I'm going to assume that the first one, the contents are molded by thought, but not the form. I actually don't know what position does that concern. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to stream the screen.
Perfect.
So either the contents are molded by thought, but not the form, or the form belongs to thought and not the contents. Not sure what position he's talking about in the first one.
Maybe a content being molded by thought is something like imagination, where imagination is in a certain sense sensible, a sensation, like you can imagine an apple, but the image of an apple in the mind is not a thought. So it doesn't. So to imagine an apple, it's not in the form of thought, even though because it's your imagination, it is a content produced by subjective thinking.
Okay, yeah. He does give an example here. He says, on the other hand, when I represent God, the content is undeniably part of pure thought, but the form still retains the sensuous limitations which it has as I find it immediately present in myself. In these
that's even better, because God never is sensible in the sense that like the apple is.
Yeah, in these generalized images, the content is not merely and simply sensible, as it is in a visual inspection, but either the content is sensuous in the form that pertains to thought, or vice versa. In the first case, the material is given to us, and our thought supplies the form. In the second case, the content, which it has its source in thought, is by means of the form turned into a something given, which accordingly reaches the mind from without. Okay. So 2, logic is the study of thought, pure and simple, or of the pure thought forms. In the ordinary sense of the term, by thought we generally represent to ourselves something more... In the ordinary sense of the terms, by thought we generally represent to ourselves something more than simple and unmixed thought. We mean some thought, the material of which is from experience. Whereas in logic, a thought is understood to include nothing else but what depends on thinking and what thinking has brought into existence. It is in these circumstances that thoughts are pure thoughts. The mind is then in its own home element and therefore free, for freedom means that the other thing with which you deal is a second self, so that you never leave your own ground but give the law to yourself. In the impulses or appetites, the beginning is from something else, from something which we feel to be external. In this case, when we speak of dependence. In this case, then, we speak of dependence. For freedom, it is necessary that we should feel no presence of something else which is not ourselves. The natural man, whose motions follow the rule only of his appetites, is not his own master. Be he as self-willed as he may, the constituents of his will and opinion are not his own, and his freedom is merely formal. But when we think, we renounce our selfish and particular being, sink ourselves in the thing, allow thought to follow its own course, and if we add anything of our own, we think ill. All right.
So when we sublate our particularity or opposition to something else particular, then we are immersed in the universal.
And the whole thing about will is an example that most people probably disagree on the face of it, but think about it just a little bit more, and it becomes obvious that no, that's actually true. There's plenty of times in which you will have desires in your life which are not in accord with your will, and that's when you realize your will is not really what you think it is. It is not just like, oh, I want this. It's a specific kind of wanting, which is not just immediately wanting whatever. It's particularly a wanting of a universal kind. It's a wanting that is mediated by some conception as a conception. At the very minimum, the conception of ourselves as an I, as a specific kind of I. And in everything else that may go wrong, the one thing where we certainly feel ourselves always to be at home and like never alien to ourselves is in our own self-thinking of ourselves. Sure, people may have intrusive, not just intrusive desires, but intrusive thoughts. But the reason those thoughts are considered intrusive is because they do not accord with our conception of ourselves. And we realize, wait, that's not me. Why did that thought pop in my head? That's not me. I didn't want to think about that, and so on. Continuing. If in pursuance of the foregoing remarks we consider logic to be the system of the pure types of thought, we find that the other philosophical sciences, the philosophy of nature and the philosophy of mind, take the place, as it were, of an applied logic, and that logic is the soul which animates them both. Their problem in that case is only to recognize the logical forms under the shapes they assume in nature and mind, shapes which are only a particular mode of expression for the forms of pure thought. If, for instance, we take the syllogism, not as it was understood in the old formal logic, but as its real value, we shall find it gives expression to the law that the particular is the middle term which fuses together the extremes of the universal and the singular. The syllogistic form is a universal form of all things. Everything that exists is a particular which couples together the universal and the singular, but nature is weak and fails to exhibit the logical forms in their purity. Such a feeble exemplification of the syllogism may be seen in the magnet. In the middle or point of indifference of a magnet, its two poles, however they may be distinguished, are brought into one. Physics also teaches us to see the universal or essence in nature, and the only difference between it and the philosophy of nature is that the latter brings before our mind the adequate forms of the notion in the physical world. So the whole thing about applied logic, many people would go ahead and say that this just makes it the same as any other formal logic, where are we really grasping things as they really are, or are we just like projecting categories on them? And the way he's phrased it right here makes it seem like we're just projecting categories on them. That's not the case. What happens is that in noticing things in nature or in mind, we notice things in accord with certain forms of pure concepts found in the logic. The recognition that these are instances of those pure concepts merely is there for, one, the systematic unity of our own knowledge about the world and everything as absolute, but second, as a way in which when we notice those things, it makes it clear how things are really working out. You can notice when something is off as far as its intelligibility and existential instances goes. Basically, it's if you notice that there's something illogical going on, because we have the exhaustive forms of logic in the science of logic, then something about what may be appearing to us to be beyond that logic has to be taken to be not new as such, because a lot of people want to go and take it, well, if it appears like magic, it must be magic. Well, no. There's one thing about you misunderstanding things and what things really are. Just like, quantum physics tends to be full of these kinds of misunderstandings, where because we lack understanding, we may jump the gun and say the universe or reality itself is ontologically like nonsensical. That's not the case. And being aware of the forms of logic is really useful for being aware of ways in which we can be bamboozled by just misunderstanding phenomena. Because you don't have to know the stuff in the science of logic to think anything else properly, but if you think it properly, you'll only do it haphazardly. You won't do it consciously, and you won't be aware of what ultimately grounds why what you're saying, thinking about such a thing is true. So continuing. The syllogistic form is a universal form of all things. Everything that exists is a particular. Okay, I already read that. It will now be understood that logic is the all-animating spirit of all the sciences in its categories, the spiritual hierarchy. They are the heart and center of all of things, and yet at the same time they are always on our lips, and apparently at least perfectly familiar objects. But things thus familiar are usually the greatest strangers. Being, for example, is a category of pure thought, but to make is an object of investigation never occurs to us. Common fancy puts the absolute far away in a world beyond. The absolute is rather directly before us, so present that so long as we think, we must, though without express consciousness of it, always carry it with us and always use it. Language is the main depository of these types of thought, and one use of the grammatical instruction which children receive which children receive is unconsciously to turn their attention to distinctions of thought. Logic is usually said to be concerned with forms only and to derive the material from them elsewhere. But this only, which assumes that the logical thoughts are nothing in comparison with the rest of the contents, is not the word to use about forms which are the absolutely real ground of everything. Everything else, rather, is an only compared with these thoughts. To make such abstract forms a problem presupposes in the inquirer a higher level of culture than ordinary. And to study them in themselves and for their own sake signifies in addition that these thought types must be deduced out of thought itself, and their truth or reality examined by the light of their own laws. We do not assume them as data from without, and then define them or exhibit their value and authority by comparing them with the shape they take in our minds. If we thus acted, we should proceed from observation and experience, and should, for instance, say we habitually employ the term force in such a case, and such a meaning. A definition like that would be called correct if it agreed with the conception of its object present in our ordinary state of mind. The defect of this empirical method is that a notion is not defined as it is in and for itself, but in terms of something assumed, which is then used as a criterion and standard of correctness. No such test need be applied. We have merely to let the thought forms follow the impulse of their own organic life. To ask if a category is true or not must sound strange to the ordinary mind, for a category apparently becomes true only when it is applied to a given object, and apart from this application it would seem meaningless to inquire into the truth. But this is the very question on which everything turns. We must, however, in the first place, understand clearly what we mean by truth. In common life, truth means the agreement of an object with our conception of it. We thus presuppose an object to which our conception must conform. In the philosophical sense of the word, on the other hand, truth may be described in general, abstract terms as the agreement of a thought content with itself. This meaning is quite different from the one given above. At the same time, the deeper and philosophical meaning of truth can be partially traced even in the ordinary usage of language. Thus we speak of a true friend, by which we mean a friend whose manner of conduct accords with the notion of friendship. In the same way we speak of a true work of art. Untrue in this sense means the same as bad or self-discordant. Save that in your memories for those of you listening. In this sense, a bad state is an untrue state, and evil and untruth may be said to consist in the contradiction subsisting between the function or notion and the existence of the object. Of such a bad object we may form a correct representation, but the import of such representation is inherently false. Of these correctnesses, which are at the same time untruths, we may have many in our heads. God alone is the thorough harmony of notion and reality, or concept and reality. All finite things involve an untruth. They may have a notion, they may have a concept and an existence, but their existence does not meet the requirements of the concept. For this reason, they must perish, and then the incompatibility between their concept and their existence becomes manifest. It is in the kind that the individual animal has its concept, and the kind liberates itself from this individuality by death. The study of truth, or, as it is here explained to mean, consistency, constitutes the proper problem of logic. In our everyday mind, we are never troubled with questions about the truth of the forms of thought. We may also express the problem of logic by saying that it examines the forms of thought touching their capability to hold truth. And the question comes to this: what are the forms of the infinite, and what are the forms of the finite? Usually no suspicion attaches to the finite forms of thought. They are allowed to pass unquestioned. But it is from conforming to finite categories of thought and action that all deception originates. This is a massively important little subsection. that whole section, and like, to ask if a category is true or not must sound strange to the ordinary mind, because usually people think it's an application, that a thing is true because it accords with something out there, and that this is backwards. I've had multiple arguments wouldn't be the proper thing, and discussion wouldn't be the proper thing either. I mean, because the other person literally cannot cognize this problem when I have presented it to them. And by the way, I had thought about it in these exact terms, and I have never read this section of the Encyclopedia, and I've never read any section where Hegel particularly talks about it in this form, but it is the form that has actually formed in my own mind, following my own thinking about what can be derived from what I do know, from what I've read from Hegel. So it's always heartening to see that one was following blindly in the exact steps of the master.
The introduction to the Encyclopedia of Logic is fantastic. I honestly recommend revisiting all of his introductions periodically. Super good for keeping you refreshed, and he says so many interesting and insightful things.
Yeah, like later on he mentioned the whole thing that the concept is accord with itself. That's what truth is. I independently derived that very phrasing for myself, and I've been using it for years, and I'd never actually directly read it from Hegel. I just inferred it from what I knew about the concept. This is the first time I've seen him particularly explicitly mention that in that phrasing. Interesting. But yes, the issue with that is if you assume the standard conception people have about truth, which is correspondence to objects or the state of affairs in the world, you snuck in a concept behind that, the concept of the thing. You assume that the thing is recognized unproblematically. Like I say there's rain, and if I look outside it and, like it's raining, oh, well, it's true that it's raining because, like it accords with the fact that there is rain. But that assumes that I know what the fuck rain is and that I just unproblematically perceive there's a thing called rain in the world. I'm not talking about you, rain. I'm talking about the phenomenon rain. And people find this mind-boggling, even though I think like conceptually it is simple. It is such a simple problem that it is anybody who thinks should notice it very quickly. And once it's brought up, you can't ignore it. That indeed, then the problem, it becomes a problem for the idea that things just correspond to the world. And Hegel says, pensions the whole thing. Well, we actually have a reverse use of that correspondence, which is a correspondence of object to concept, like the true friend, true gold, and whatnot. And he says, but, philosophy requires a higher demand. Empirically, we do use both senses of correspondence, both to the state of affairs and the state of affairs to the concept or the proposition or definition. But philosophy demands to ask, well, is the concept itself true? But then what is this asking? Like, how can this make sense? And everybody else who isn't a Hegelian has to like stand back, or at least not a German idealist, has to stand back and scratch their heads and say, I don't even know what you're asking. Because indeed, it's not obvious what one is asking unless you go through something like Hegel and start seeing that there is an actual structure to concepts, and then you understand quite clearly how it would be possible for one, a thing to correspond to itself as a thought, and two, and he later mentions this, I don't like the phrase even though it's true, he says like this is really a coherence of a thing with itself. Where is it? He says it, Noble Troubles, exams touching their capability to hold truth. Wait, did I skip something? Where was this? Oh, anyways, he mentions here somewhere that it's a coherence. I don't think he mentioned the coherence thing explicitly, but what was it? Consistency. As it is here explained to mean consistency. Consistency and correspondence are the exact same thing. Because if a thing is consistent it means that it corresponds to itself. And
What does Hegel think of the laws of thought? So, for example, like the law of identity.
As stated in classical logic and modern propositional and or the formal logics, they're not really laws of thought. They're just stipulations that people don't quite understand why they must hold, and we have negative reasons for why they must hold, but we don't have any positive reasons for why they do. Hegel can explain exactly why they must hold to a certain extent. Like identity, coherency, consistency, correspondence, all are derived from the exact same thing and are specified moments and distinctions of the same thing. So insofar as you have identity, identity must be a self-correspondence. Insofar as you have a self-correspondence, it must be self-consistent. Insofar as it's self-consistent, it must be self-constituting. Insofar as it's self-constituting, it must be self-determining. It must, generate itself. Insofar as it generates itself, it must be independent, which is an objectivity concern, therefore it must be objective. And literally everything you want to cash out, directly connecting logic to ontology or the structure of being or itself, reality, is cashed out absolutely by Hegel, no question. Of course, people will listen to that and go like, oh, well, then why do logicians and the usual analytic philosophers and continentals dislike Hegel so much? That sounds like great. That sounds like the dream of philosophy, right? Why would people get so mad at this guy? Well, because the way it ultimately cashes out is against their own intuitions. It does not cash out the way people would like it to cash out, because they're used to things being in the form of just static identities, whereas the consistency for Hegel is ultimately an inconsistency. What is consistent is inconsistency itself, but inconsistency is inconsistent with itself, which is its own consistency. And these things appear...
So like a negation?
You can call it many things, but the thing is, it manifests what appears to be a contradiction, and contradiction is just generally taken to be bad by everybody. Both continentals and analytics, classical philosophers, and post-German idealists.
When you say a contradiction, you're referring to the law of non-contradiction, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Does he reject that?
Yes, he rejects it in one sense. He rejects it in the sense that people have come to meet it as a sort of propositional and applying only in that form when it's taken as the form of specific moments. It's perfectly fine. Of course, a thing has to be itself in being itself when considered as being itself, and when considered under that moment, it cannot be considered at the same time in its difference moment. But these two hold at different moments. If you hold them as moments, it's perfectly fine. You can't break it, and Hegel does not break that. But that is a much stronger form of non-contradiction, which in a certain sense Hegel does break nonetheless, that a thing in truly being itself has to not be itself. But this is perfectly intelligible, and it's not a problem.
May I ask a question about idealism? I'm not sure if this is the right space, because I'm pretty sure.
Go ahead and ask, and if it's not, I'll answer later.
What's the difference between subjective idealism and absolute idealism?
Don't worry about that kind of categorization. These are not really related in that sense. I have a video on it if you want to look at it.
Sure.
Yeah, just look at my channel. It's probably the newest video, I think, of what is absolute idealism.
Which one, sorry?
It's on my channel. You can check my bio.
Oh, okay. All right, thank you.
Let's see. What else did I want to comment on? So truth, self-correspondence, self-coherence, massively important, solves basically the whole problem, makes it possible to tell an objective concept as concept. No longer do you have these issues of, well, I define this as that, well, I define this as that, where, strangely enough, people accept that mode of expression and positing, and are aware that this is purely subjective, and nonetheless want to debate about these things as if they were objective, as if they can just point to something out in the world that will settle the issue, as, you know, a standing, independent thing, when they know very well that that's not the case. It's a server I semi-regularly frequent, and that's just the main thing that happens. And people are aware of it, and it just boggles the mind. It's like, if you're aware of this, why are you even bothering with having these discussions? They're not even discussions. They're not even debates. They're not worth calling anything truly intellectual. It's just people yelling at each other and, you know, attacking each other's positions from, like, different grounds for nothing but, you know, internet fame points. What was it? Oh, yes. Commenting on the ontology thing. Untrue in the sense it means the same as bad or self-discordant. This is massively important. It's an ontological consideration of ethical substance, and which goes beyond mere ethics and beyond morality. This is like the good in general, abstractly is. You know, something is good insofar as it truly is, and insofar as it truly corresponds to itself. Insofar as it truly corresponds to itself, it's self-coherent. Insofar as it's self-coherent, you know, it's self-generating, self-determining, all these other things, and therefore goodness and being are one. Therefore, evil must be the opposite. And then, but, you know, one may be aware, obviously, that Hegel is a philosopher of contradiction, and then they're like, well, wait, isn't he contradicting himself here? You know, that he's saying that self-discordance, which would be contradiction, is bad? No. Because here what is meant is something different than an actual contradiction. An actual contradiction is good, because it's true. They are false contradictions which things don't link up together, and therefore they just fall apart. Not because they have contradicted themselves, properly speaking, but because they have just actually failed to be. You know, just like how a bad seed will not, you know, propagate the species anymore. And if that was all the species could produce, a bad seed, then the species itself destroys itself. You know, a bad thing, he says, you know, in this sense, a bad state is an untrue state, and evil and untruth may be said to consist in the contradiction subsisting between the function or notion that exists the object. Of such a bad object may form a correct representation, blah, blah, blah. Where he says, for this reason, they must perish, and the incompatibility between their notion and their existence becomes manifest. So the fact that a thing destroys itself is the consequence of its own false being, that it really isn't. So if a thing blips into existence once and then disappears forever, never to arise again, by its own power at least, we know that thing was bad insofar as it had no truth in it. You know, and anything bad will destroy itself. That is the consequence of all evil, which is why Hegel says, don't worry about the good will always win. Evil literally cannot win. It is not real. It will destroy itself. It doesn't matter if it seems to be that evil is eternal because, you know, you've had like an evil empire for 1,000 years or whatever. That doesn't matter. The fact that things end up destroying themselves is the proof that, you know, you don't have to worry about evil. Evil cannot win.
It can only persist in existing insofar as it hasn't fully succumbed to its evil
Yeah, it's always
because
parasitic.
its capacity, to ever even enact itself has presupposed the good, and so whatever evil it accomplishes is diminishing its very own ability to enact its reality.
Yep. So let's see, God alone is a thorough harmony of concept and reality. All finite things involve an untruth. They have a concept and an existence, but their existence does not meet the requirements of the concept. For this reason, they must perish, and an incompatibility between their concept and their existence becomes manifest. It is in the kind that the individual animal has its concept, and the kind liberates itself from this individuality by death. So here Hegel's saying that, anything that's truly finite has to die, no matter what. There is no escaping it. But if you are a kind like an animal, for example, the fact that the individual dies in the process of the concept itself living, the species as a whole, nonetheless is the truth of the whole thing momentarily in the single finite thing. And the finite's purpose is, because it is finite, to pass away. So the finite, merely taken as finite, is false because it must perish, it must be passed over into the infinite. But this is itself its truth. And if it really lets itself go into this truth, then it does not actually die, which is why spirit is superior to nature. Spirit does not actually die with the body, insofar as a human being.
Okay.
Yeah, insofar as a human being, achieved its true kind, it is the spirit. And the spirit is recognized to be not this body, but the universal, living substance that is only momentarily in this body, using this body as a vehicle for, the divine ends of freedom. And then moves away. But when it moves on from this body, there is no sadness, because it was always already recognized that this body is only momentary, while the truth is eternal, and I am, in essence, the truth. As everyone who's a thinking being, in essence, is that. And which is why, technically speaking, someone like Socrates, who died, 2,500 years ago, is very much still alive. Someone like Plato is very much still alive. Who they really were was these universal thoughts. If we mistake who these people really were as merely the individuality that, blipped into the world once, we don't fully understand who they were, nor do we understand who we are. It's also why Hegel's concept of immortality does not involve what most people think of in immortality. Hegel does not care about an afterlife. Hegel does not care about, the possibility of reincarnation, because these are not true immortality. True immortality is to find my eternity here and now, to realize I am that infinite instantiated as an individual here and now, that I have specific determinations, that I have specific actions that I can take as that infinite through these limitations, and that I can carry these things out and therefore be true to my essence, be truly who I am. And in doing so, I do not fear death, and I do not crave this endless duration of my own subjective experience, because I'm satisfied with my individual lot. I'm satisfied that this is the absolute here and now, that I accomplish everything that it must be accomplished, and I let myself go. I realize that the world does not rest on my shoulders. It's okay. Everything will be fine. God will take care of it. I've done my part. I can rest in peace. see how much longer. Okay, we'll finish this little section 3, and that will be the end for this reading. So 3. Truth may be ascertained by several methods, each of which, however, is no more than a form. Experience is the first of these methods, but the method is only a form. It has no intrinsic value of its own. For in experience, everything depends upon the mind we bring to bear upon actuality. A great mind is great in its experience, and in the motley play of phenomena, at once perceives the point of real significance. The idea is present in actual shape, not something, as it were, over the hill and far away. The genius of Goethe, for example, looking into nature or history, has great experiences, catches sight of the living principle, and gives expression to it. A second method of apprehending truth is reflection, which defines it by intellectual relations of condition and conditioned. In these two modes, the absolute truth has not yet found its appropriate form. The most perfect method of knowledge proceeds in the pure form of thought, and here the attitude of man is one of entire freedom. That the form of thought is the perfect form, and that it presents the truth as it intrinsically and actually is the general dogma of all philosophy. To give a proof of the dogma, there is, in the first instance, nothing to do but show that these other forms of knowledge are finite. The grand skepticism of antiquity accomplished this task when it exhibited the contradictions contained in every one of these forms. That skepticism indeed went further, but when it ventured to assail the forms of reason, it began by insinuating under them something finite upon which it might fasten. All the forms of finite thought will make their appearance in the course of logical development, the order in which they present themselves being determined by necessary laws. Here in the introduction, they could only be unscientifically assumed as something given. In the theory of logic itself, these forms will be exhibited not only in their negative, but also in their positive side. When we compare the different forms of ascertaining truth with one another, the first of them, immediate knowledge, may perhaps seem the finest, noblest, and most appropriate. It includes everything which the moralists term innocence, as well as religious feeling, simple trust, love, fidelity, and natural faith. The two other forms, first reflective and secondly philosophical cognition, must leave the unsought natural harmony behind. And so far as they have this in common, the methods which claim to apprehend the truth by thought may naturally be regarded as part and parcel of the pride that leads man to trust to his own powers for a knowledge of the truth. Such a position involves a thoroughgoing disruption, and viewed in that light, might be regarded as the source of all evil and wickedness, the original transgression. Apparently, therefore, the only way of being reconciled and restored to peace is to surrender all claims to think or know. Pretty clear. The only thing I have to comment on is this last part. The two other forms, first reflective and secondly philosophical cognition, must leave that unsought natural harmony behind. And so far as they have this in common, the methods which claim to apprehend the truth by thought may naturally be regarded as part and parcel of the pride which leads man to trust to his own powers for a knowledge of the truth. Such a position involves a thoroughgoing disruption, and viewed in that light might be regarded as the source of all evil and wickedness, the original transgression. This concerns every person who says, look, I think for myself, I don't take things as given, I don't accept any authorities, but they don't, and they just go ahead and think. Hegel has a phrase in the Phenomenology of Spirits introduction, preface, they think as if, a bullet shot out of the barrel of a gun at the beginning of a race. But, the thrust is completely arbitrary, completely subjective. They think willy-nilly. And this is quite common. We have a few people on this server that proceed in that way. And they're like, oh, I had this thought the other day. And, isn't that interesting? Well, yes, you had a representation of some kind that, arbitrarily is there. And you wondered, well, what if God is quantum? What if quantum fluctuations are actually this or that? Those are just arbitrary thoughts in people's minds, and in a way, one can say there's something admirable in that. It is going against the grain, and it is necessary to rip oneself away from the given conventions. But then to just take one's own givens arbitrarily and to run with that willy-nilly ultimately is not any more admirable than just taking things as given because somebody else tells you so. Because in the other one, at least you're aware somebody else tells you so. And the other one, you're not aware that really you're just regenerating many things which unconsciously you have taken up in your life, which other people have told you so, and you don't realize that they have told you so. And you're just recapitulating the very culture which you pretend to escape. So, really, if you truly want to free yourself and be a genuine thinker, and, so a lot of these people are obsessed with, being original. Well, if you're a genuine thinker, you don't care about originality. You understand you are not the originator of anything. If there is such a thing as objective thought, there is such a thing as the objective truth, it will not depend on you. Therefore, to align yourself with reality and truth has nothing to do with originality whatsoever, because you definitely won't be the origin of any of it. But all right, unless anybody has something else to ask or comment about that, we will leave that here, and we'll start with Tales and Allegories of Religion next time. All right, seems nobody has any further comments to make. So for those of you listening, continue on listening next time. See you around.